Hi, this is Ben. This video is about UV texture mapping in Blender and getting the UV texture map data exported into Collada. I found that texture mapping in Blender is complicated and the texture information is not always exported to Collada. This video is about one pathway that is known to work. Hopefully we can get more general in the future. So I'm starting from scratch. I have a folder here called Texture Export Demo, and the only thing in it so far is this JPEG with an image of a stone wall. This is what we want to wrap around an object as the object's diffuse reflectance. So now I'll start Blender. I'm using Blender 2.76. All we really need is this startup file from Blender with a camera, a point light, and this cube object, which we can wrap the image around. To do UV mapping, the first thing we need to do is cut a seam around the object, which allows Blender to unwrap the 3D object into a 2D representation, which will be lined up with our image file. So I'm going to hit Tab and enter Edit Mode. I'm going to deselect everything by pressing A. Now I'm going to select Edge Select Mode. Now I'm going to start selecting edges by holding Shift and right-clicking. I'm going to select edges like a baseball seam so that we can have one loop cutting the cube in 2 equal parts. Now we've selected the seam we want. We can hit Control E and choose Mark Seam. So now the edges turn red. That's a seam around the cube. Now return to face mode and select everything. Now using this seam, we want to unwrap the cube. We need another view to do that, so I'll split my Blender view. And in this new view, I'm going to select UV Image Editor. Now we have all our cube faces selected. I'm going to hit U and unwrap. Now, in our UV editor, we see the 6 faces of the cube unwrapped. Great, so now let's bring in the image file and apply it. We have our cube selected in the outline view. We have a material assigned to the cube. I'll just rename that stone. We can also assign a texture to the cube. We have a texture named text. I'll just call that stone. Now, what type of texture? Let's have an image texture. And down here in the image area, we'll open the image we want. This is the stone wall we saw earlier. Now, here in the UV area, we can look at the stone wall, and we can see how our unwrapped cube faces are going to line up with the texture image. We can actually preview this live in Blender. Over here in the 3D view, I'll hit N to get some more options. And under Shading, I'm going to click Textured Solid. Now we can see that the stones are wrapped around the cube. And just to prove that this is real, I'll go to our UVs. I'll choose Constrain to Image Bounds. And now I have all of these faces selected. I'll hit G to move them. I can drag them around the texture image, and the cube preview is updated accordingly. So it looks to me like we have successfully defined the UV coordinates of our cube and mapped a texture onto those coordinates and therefore onto the cube. This is great. Finally, export to Collada. This is easy. We just have to make sure we choose the correct options. So in the export view, make sure we click include these textures. And for render toolbox, it's more convenient to have separate route and lock transformations. as opposed to a joined matrix transformation. We're ready to go now. We can export this DAE Collada file. Now, as a final sanity check, let's open up this new Collada file and see what we got. I'll use Text Wrangler, which is a nice, robust text editor. The Collada is a lot, and we don't want to read it all, so I'm going to find our stone and see where that occurs in the document. The first place it occurs is in this library images. That's great. It means our Collada file is pointing to our JPEG file, and that's going to allow us to find the resource we need later on. Where else does this occur? It occurs in library effects. Effects are related to materials in Collada, and they define many of the details of how a material appears. And inside this stone effect, we see some familiar names. We see Stonewall JPEG. That's great. So this effect is pointing at our JPEG file. That's an association we need. Also, importantly, we have the diffuse property of this effect is defined not as an RGB value, but as a texture, and specifically the Stonewall JPEG texture. So that's an association we need. Where else do we have stone? We have this stone material. The material simply points at the effect. So we have a material that we can apply to an object, and the details of how that material appear are well defined using our texture. Probably have a few more occurrences. We have our polylist that's related to the geometry of the cube, and we see that that also refers to this stone material. We also see that the geometry of our cube includes vertex positions, face normals, and texture coordinates. So that's another piece of data that we need to do texture mapping later on. That's good news. And down below, we will have a Collada node. This is a top-level container for geometry, materials, and other things. And we see that we have our stone material referenced from our cube node. So this Collada file is looking good. It has all the information we specified in Blender, and this will give us something to work with and the necessary associations for Render Toolbox.